Mr. Bloom has to keep the class, and fortunately he arrived at the same time. And without further ado, I will introduce him, Mr. Howard Bloom.
The talk is called Freud, Jewishness Against Myth. In 1984, nearly a century after Freud began his therapeutic career, it seems quite incredible that he should have died as much as 45 years ago, on September 23rd, 1939, at a still extraordinarily active 83. We live now more than ever in the age of Freud. Despite the relative decline that psychoanalysis has begun to cover as a public institution and as a medical specialty. Freud's universal and comprehensive theory of the mind probably will outlive the psychoanalytical therapy, and seems already to have placed him with Plato and Montaigne and Shakespeare, rather than with the scientists he overtly aspired to emulate. This is not to suggest that Freud was primarily a philosopher, an essayist, or a poet, but rather that his influence has been analogous to that of Plato, Montaigne, Shakespeare, inescapable, immense, almost incalculable. In some sense, I don't know if you get happy at saying this, in some sense we are all Freudians, whether we want to be or not. Freud is much more than a perpetual fashion, and that he really seems to have become a culture, our culture. He is at once the principal writer and the principal thinker of our century. If one seeks the strongest authors in the West in our time, most readers would agree, I think, upon the crucial figures. Proust, Joyce, Kafka, Yeats, Mann, Lawrence, Eliot, Rilke, Faulkner, Valery, Stevens, Montaigne, Samuel Beckett certainly would be among them. The essential thinkers might constitute a shorter and much more controversial canon, whether as scientists or philosophers, and I will not venture to list them here. Freud is unique in that he would dominate the second group and probably successfully challenge even Proust, Joyce, Kafka in the first. What can one match him with any of the religious figures or scholars of the century? His only rivals indeed are from the past. Plato, Montaigne, Shakespeare, or even that anonymous primal narrator of Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, called the J-writer or Yahwist by biblical scholarship. It is this unique stature, this pervasive influence of Freud, that now constitutes the overwhelming element in his achievement. Perhaps his effect upon us is even more important than the apparently lasting value of his general theory of the mind. Himself the creator of the darkest Western vision of fatherhood since at least the ancient Gnostics, he has become a generic father figure in Western culture, a fate he would have sternly resented. His Viennese contemporary, the almost apocalyptic satirist Karl Kraus, bitterly observed that psychoanalysis itself was the mental illness, was spiritual disease, of which it purported to be the cure. This remains, I think, certainly the most destructive remark that Freud ever has provoked, because it centers unerringly upon what is most problematic in Freud's writing and in Freud's therapy, the intimately related ideas of authority and of transference. In the name of his science, Freud audaciously usurped authority and triumphantly manifested an originality comparable even to Shakespeare. Perhaps he subsumed Schopenhauer and Nietzsche in something of the way in which Shakespeare can be said to have swallowed up poor Christopher Marlowe. Iago and Edmund still have traces of the Marlowean hero-villain, but Othello and Lear are gigantic universes of language, while the Jew of Malta and Tamerlane, in comparison, seem only very local regions of powerful rhetoric. Schopenhauer lurks uneasily in the Freudian mythology of the tribes, and Nietzsche, tracing the genealogy of morals, perhaps haunts Freud's account of our need for punishment, the economics of what Freud so horribly calls moral masochism. But we read Marlowe now with the shadow of Shakespeare, and the psychoanalytical acuity of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer appears quite fitful in direct juxtaposition to Freud's uncanny stories of our unconscious mental processes. Great havoc makes he among our originalities, Emerson ruefully observed of Plato. And Emerson came very near to saying the same of Montaigne and of Shakespeare. I very much regret to say that we must say of Freud, after him there is only commentary. The aim is to be free. And after Freud, we are never free of Freud. The subject was psychic over-determination or unconscious bondage, or to put it very simply, the inability to begin freshly rather than to repeat. Eros, he taught, is never free, but always a repetition, always a transference in authority from past to present. Presumably just this sense of enforced illusion gave Freud his double concept of taboo and transference, two heightened versions of emotional ambivalence, of simultaneous love and hatred invested in the same object to nearly equal degree, a conflict manifested in that other masterpiece of emotional ambivalence, the beautiful complex. Love, according to Freud, always relies upon the fixations of infantile sexuality for its origins, suffers from the felt stigma of the narcissistic star, the infant's first tragic failure in sexual strife, or its loss of the parents of the opposite sex to the rival, the parents of the same sex. Already necessarily neurotic, love thus is usefully vulnerable to the artificial neuroses of the psychoanalytical transference, the false errors induced by Freud and his followers for therapeutic purposes, or as a perfectly fresh wound inflicted supposedly to heal a wound. The analytical transference marks the crisis in Freud's vision of Eros, a crisis that is the hidden point of Paul Krauss's bitter jest that psychoanalysis itself was the psychic malady that it only offered to cure. By 1984, psychoanalysis in a societal sense really has become a kind of universal transference neurosis. As the figure of Freud has assumed a perfectly mythological status, darkly akin to the totemic father who was slain and devoured in that ghastly primal history scene of totem and taboo. As the dead father, Freud is stronger than any living father can be. Indeed, Freud has blended into the man Moses, a new Moses to be sure, replacing monotheism, but hardly with the religion of science. The dead ancestor has become a numinous shadow for his adherents, like a Nietzschean irony that haunts many other modern secularists. The late Foucault once observed that Marxism swims in 19th century thought as a fish swims in the sea. one could not make the same remark about what I suggest we begin to call the Freudian speculation. Though Freud absolutely emerged from the age of Darwin, he is a curiously timeless figure, as old as Jewish memory itself. His Jewishness is far more central to him than he cared to believe, and together with Oct may be retrospectively definitive of what Jewish culture can still be as the end of the century approaches. Gershon Scholem, who loved Oct's writings and rather resented Freud's, once said of Oct that they had for certain readers, like Scholem himself, something of the strong light of the canonical, of that perfection which destroys. For certain other readers, like myself, Freud's writings share exactly that quality with Oct. Though barely touched by normative Judaism, Freud and Oct were Jewish writers, just as Scholem was. Someday, perhaps, not so far in the future, all three together may be seen as having redefined Jewish culture between them. Freud, in his overt polemic against religion, insisted upon reducing all religion to the longing for the fall. This reduction makes sense only in an Hebraic universal discourse, where authority always resides in figures of the individual's past and only rarely survives in the individual prophet. The Greek spirit encouraged an individual agon for contemporary authority, an agon made possible by the example of the Homeric heroes. But if the hero is Abraham or Jacob, rather than Achilles or Odysseus, he provides a much more anxious example. Plato was ironically Homeric in entering upon a struggle with Homer for the mind of Athens. But the Rabbi Akiba would never have seen himself as struggling with Moses for the mind of Jerusalem. Zeus was not incommensurate with the godlike Achilles. Abraham, arguing with Yahweh on the road to Sodom, scales down God's demand for the number of righteous men required to prevent the destruction of the city, but knows he is absolutely nothing in himself when face to face with Yahweh. Yet in his humane desperation, Father Abraham pragmatically needs to act momentarily as if he were absolutely everything in himself. Indeed, I will now repeat the next sentence, which I have italicized twice. It is Jewish and not Greek to vacillate so dizzily between the need to be everything in oneself and the anxiety of being nothing in oneself. It is Jewish and not Greek to vacillate so dizzily between the need to be everything in oneself and the anxiety of being nothing in oneself. That vertigo is the condition that makes necessary what Freud called defense or repression, the flight from prohibited representations of desire. But what are the motives for such flight? Why do we have the defense and repression? Since Freud insists upon defining the drive as that which yields pleasure when fulfilled, what can it be that sets off by displeasure, the act of repression? After years of search, I find no overt answer to this crucial question in Freud, whose characteristic dualism perhaps was too fundamental for a question. The only answer, I think, is implicit in the dualism, a point once shrewdly noted by the Dutch psychologist J.H. Vandenberg, whom I quote now. The theory of repression, he says, is closely related to the thesis that there is sense in everything, which in turn implies that everything is past and there is nothing new. That's the end of the quotation. That is to say, we can understand repression only in a psychic world where everything is absolutely meaningful, where a symptom or a witticism or a verbal slip is so overdetermined that enormous interpretive intensity can and must be applied. Such a world, at once the realm of the great normative rabbis and of Freud, Such a world takes place when everything is over already, when the truly significant has happened once and for all, and nothing more can ever happen. The time of the fathers for the rabbis is absolutely akin to Freud's age of infancy, when we are scarred forever. What for the rabbis was called significant memory appears in Freud under the sign of negation as unconscious but purposeful forgetting or repression. But this Freudian negation is precisely Jewish or rabbinic, marked by the Hebraic mode of dualism, which I would insist is not a split between mind or soul on the one side and body on the other, or between the self and nature, but a much subtler dichotomy between inwardness and outwardness. This is indeed prophetic dualism. The stance of Elijah and of the whole line of his successors from Amos to Malachi. In standing against the unjust world, Elijah and his disciples always proclaimed that justice must be established against the world, with a deep inwardness of morality that wars against all outwardness whatsoever. But what is this, if we transfer it to the Freudian register, except the moral basis for what I think we must call Freud's only transcendence, his only Platonism, as it were, which is reality testing or learning to live with the reality principle, which is to say, learning to live with death. Why, after all, according to Freud, is the psyche at civil war? What does the psyche war with in itself, except the injustice of outwardness, the repressive vicissitudes of the tribes, the moronic sufferings that rob us of the freedom that yet can give time to time, so that perhaps for a single moment it might after all be our time. To mistake Freudian negation is to utterly destroy his dualism, which I think is the destruction of more than just his intrinsic Jewishness, and yet precisely this is the ironic effect of what has come to be called French Freud. The revisionary reading of Freud carried through by the late Jacques Lacan and his many followers. Essentially, I would insist this has involved the Hegelianizing of Freud, a harmless enough enterprise, but really rather hard, since the Freudian speculation rarely evades for very long the ultimate authority of given fact. Herbert Marcuse, who did not confuse Freud with Hegel, once analyzed Hegel's intellectual optimism as being based upon a destructive concept of the given, with knowledge originating only when philosophy destroyed the experience of daily life, by way of a double process of negation, first being the negation of every object, and second, the negation of the individual ego. That, as Marcuse knew, is absolutely not Freud, but it is certainly the anti-empirical Freud of Lacan, Malebranche, and Derrida. French Freud teaches the reduction of the actual Freud's metapsychological dualism to a mere psychical duplicity, fit expression of a psycholinguistic skepticism. The effect of this reduction is to undo Freud's more radical dualism between primary and secondary processes and between the pleasure and reality principles. But the final consequence, far more important, is that the entire Freudian theory of the mind is converted into a kind of phantasmagoric monism, in which the primal ambivalence of monistic narcissism becomes our ruling passion. The psyche's civil war will then take place entirely within a narcissistic, mostly unconscious ego, rather than between the ego and the id, or the ego and the superego. Freud would cease to be a dualist, and the final irony of Lacan's accomplishment will be that he has revised Freud into a monism at least as flat as that of Alfred Adler. Doubtless an adherent of French Freud could respond to me that whatever distortion Lacan or Derrida bring about is still still greatly preferable the revisionary ego psychology of Heinz Hartmann, or the severe and utterly sadistic modifications made by the British followers of the savage feminine plot. Our inability to characterize Freud accurately without revising him is, I would say, a true sign of his very strength. His central ideas, the drives, the defenses, the psychic agencies, the dynamic unconscious, are all frontier concepts. Concepts that make no clear demarcations between mind and body. Freud's science, call it that, psychoanalysis, is, I think, neither primarily speculative poetic nor empirical therapeutic, but is exactly on the border between them and between all prior disciplines. So necessarily, Freud's concept of negation is a frontier idea also, breaking down utterly the distinction between inwardness and outwardness. In Freudian negation, I am saying, as in what was called normative Jewish memory, a previously repressed thought, desire, or feeling achieves formulation only by being disowned, so that it is cognitively accepted, but still affectively denied. Thought is thus freed from its sexual past, precisely as thinking is desexualized also in the rituals of normative Judaism. Richard Walheim has related Freud's idea of negation to Freud's immensely difficult realization that the ego is always a bodily ego. So the capacity to assign truth or falsehood to an assertion is traced to a very primitive movement of mind, where a kind of thought is felt and is then either introjected, that is to say, swallowed up, or projected, simply spit it out. This explains how negation works so as to internalize certain objects of the mind, an internalization that results presumably in the bodily ego. But both phrases, both notions, an internalized object and a bodily ego are immensely difficult fictions or metaphors. How, after all, can a thought become an object? Even if that object has somehow been introjected by one's bodily ego. The only way I can explain this to myself or to anyone else is to say that Freud's language here is radically poetic and mythological, and is precisely akin to the Hebrew Bible's prophetic language of that intensified moral inwardness which itself personifies justice, and which also broke down the frontiers between the soul and the outward world. And I want to finish in a brief quote. I come full circle here by returning to the idea of a psychic cosmos, rabbinical and Freudian, in which there is sense in everything, because everything already is in the past, and nothing that matters, alas, can ever again be utterly removed. Rabbinical memory to this very moment insists that all meanings are present already in the Bible, in its normative commentaries, and in the oral law represented in each generation by the interpreters who stand somehow centrally in the tradition. If everything is there already, then everything in the Bible has got to be absolutely meaningful. If you mix together this passion for total intelligibility with the discarding of every mythology, of every possible idolatry, of the possibility of any mere irrationalism, then you are very close to Freud's own stance regarding individual consciousness or memory. I think finally this must be why Freud had the shocking audacity in the special preface he wrote for the Hebrew version of Totem and Taboo to affirm the inward Jewishness of his science, and to hint even that he might be forming the Judaism of the future. That is to say, the second commandment, thou shalt not make any graven image, in our time seems to be called primal repression, which, as we know, takes place last before there is anything to be repressed. I conclude this talk by returning to Emerson on Plato, the book Representative Men, because what Emerson says of Plato there seems to me, and I say this with great sorrow, true of Freud also. And I end by quoting Emerson on Plato. There was never such range of speculation. Out of Plato come all things that are still written and debated among men of thought. Great havoc they see among our originalities. We have reached the mountain from which all these drift boulders were detached.